The dim light of dawn filtered through the beige curtains, casting long streaks across the worn-out carpet of the third-floor apartment, nestled deep within a public housing complex in South Boston. In the small kitchen, barely big enough for a table and two chairs, Naomi Carter gently turned away from the stove, holding a steaming cup of black coffee in her hand. The heat rose against her bare face, making her brown skin glow under the early sunlight. Her eyes were heavy, her legs sore, but she stood tall. It was the posture of someone long accustomed to treating exhaustion like a companion. The clock on the wall read 6:07 a.m. Naomi set down the coffee cup and turned to prepare toast for her daughter. On the sofa, a little girl with tousled curls was still curled up in a blanket, murmuring, "Mommy," in a hoarse, sleepy voice. "Breakfast is ready, sweetheart," Naomi said, her voice as soft as velvet. She bent down and smoothed a messy curl from her daughter's forehead. "I have to leave early today. Miss Davis will take you to school." It was a morning like so many others, hurried, pressing, and weighed down with worry. But today there was something different. A flicker of fragile hope. A new job had just been confirmed in a phone call the night before. Cleaning a private estate. The pay was double her old housekeeping job at the hospital. Naomi didn't know much except the name of the estate, Aspen Ridge, located in Martha's Vineyard a few hours from Boston. The client had been described as a reclusive, high-powered businessman with extremely high standards. All Naomi knew was that the promised pay from this cleaning job could cover at least a month of her mother's cancer treatment bills. And in Naomi's world, a month wasn't just time, it was life. She quickly tied her hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, slipped on her faded maroon coat, and peeked into her mother's room. Evelyn Carter lay still on the bed, her thin arms visible beneath a light blanket. The chemotherapy machine blinked quietly. Naomi silently changed the IV bag and placed two small pills into the glass cup beside the bed. "Mom, I'm heading out a little early today. I left porridge warming in the pot. Don't forget to take your meds after you eat, okay?" Evelyn opened her eyes slightly, offering a faint smile. "A new job. Where is it, honey?" Naomi squeezed her mother's hand. "A bit far, but it's a good job. I'll come home early if I can." "Naomi, you've already sacrificed so much," her mother whispered. "Has anyone ever asked you what you need?" Naomi lowered her head, silent. Then she smiled, as if that very smile could hide the bruises inside. "If you live a few more years, Mom, then I have everything I need." She stood up and stepped back, her gaze lingering on her mother, as if afraid that leaving now might mean missing something forever. On the old bus leaving Boston at 7:15 a.m., Naomi sat by the window, her head resting against the cold glass, a manila envelope containing her resume and reference letters clutched in her hand. The sea breeze began to blow through the cracked window, carrying the salty mist of the island. The streets grew quieter, red brick buildings giving way to golden maple groves, signaling that autumn had reached the island. She had no idea what awaited her behind the gates of Aspen Ridge. An eccentric employer, a grueling job, or perhaps something life had never dared to promise. But Naomi Carter was not the type to run from challenges. 10 years as a nurse, 2 years as a single mother, and countless nights staring death in the eye in hospital rooms had taught her one thing. Sometimes the only thing keeping us standing is a resilience no one else can see. The bus gently turned left, stopping at a cobblestone road lined with tall trees leading to a quiet white mansion, nestled among vibrant golden leaves. Aspen Ridge appeared like an entirely different world, distant, luxurious, and full of mystery. Naomi tightened her grip on the strap of her bag and stepped off the bus. She took a deep breath, as if to steady the heartbeat racing in her chest. Today was just the beginning, but maybe it was also the first day of a new chapter, one where fate begins to open a door no one ever saw coming. If you believe that everyone deserves a fresh start, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and hit follow to walk alongside Naomi on her journey of healing and love. This story is only just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The nearly 3-meter-tall black iron gate slowly creaked open, revealing a long cobblestone path, stretching deep into the estate grounds. At the top of the gate, a bronze-plated letter A glinted under the faint autumn sun, as if it were proudly looking down upon the outside world, a world to which it did not belong. Naomi Carter tightened the strap of her bag, stepping through the gate as though crossing an invisible boundary. Here, every stone slab, every meticulously trimmed row of trees, and every plum-colored rose trembling in the breeze exuded a silence that felt almost surreal. a silence not born of peace, but of cold detachment. The Aspen Ridge mansion appeared before her like a dream frozen in reality. Three ivory-white stories, contemporary architecture, tinged with a hint of Gothic flair, and vast glass panels that looked straight out to sea like silent eyes, observing the world without a blink. Naomi had never stepped into a place like this. She had scrubbed floors in major hospitals, disinfected hundreds of emergency rooms, lived in an apartment where people argued about rent through walls as thin as paper. But Aspen Ridge was a different story. It whispered arrogantly, "I do not belong to your kind." A middle-aged woman with a thin frame and sharp eyes opened the front door. She wore a crisply ironed white blouse, black flats, and had her hair pinned in a tight bun. Her lips were pressed into a firm line, as if they were seldom used to smile. "Ms. Carter," she asked, her eyes scanning Naomi from head to toe, like she was inspecting merchandise. "Yes, I'm Naomi Carter." Naomi replied, polite but not meek. "Call me Mrs. Whitmore," the woman said. "I'm the housekeeper. I'll walk you through the job. And one thing must be clear before we begin. Under no circumstances are you to enter the west wing of the mansion." Naomi nodded slightly, her eyes unconsciously drifting toward the left hallway, where dark wooden doors were tightly shut like a silent threat. They began walking through the rooms. The living room was as vast as a concert hall, with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers suspended like frozen dewdrops. The walnut floors gleamed, reflecting each footstep. The kitchen was large, its white marble walls and sleek modern appliances, giving it the coldness of a showroom rather than a place where meals were ever prepared. "You'll be responsible for the ground floor and the second floor," Mrs. Whitmore said evenly, pointing to each section. "Use this solution for the glass, that one for the wood. Never mix hot water with the green disinfectant. And every morning, change the guest room bed linens, whether used or not." Naomi memorized every instruction, her mind operating like a carefully marked map. But the deeper she went into the mansion, the more she felt that something was missing. Not life, clearly, someone lived here, but the presence of humanity. No family photos, no signs of cozy evenings, no half-read books left on tables, no lingering notes of music in the air. "Does anyone else live here besides the owner?" Naomi asked, as if trying to grasp onto some warmth within the cold. "Just me, the private chef who arrives in the morning and leaves before noon, a gardener who comes twice a week, and Mr. Ashford's nurse." Mrs. Whitmore's voice faltered ever so slightly. "He doesn't like having many people around." Naomi gave a soft nod. No one had to spell it out. The thick absence throughout the mansion made it clear its owner was hiding. From the world, from people, perhaps even from himself. After an hour of orientation, Mrs. Whitmore left Naomi in the living room, handed her the task list, and disappeared upstairs. Naomi stood alone in the vast room, its walls adorned with unnamed abstract paintings, feeling as if she had just stepped into an old cathedral, silent, grand, and hollow. She got to work scrubbing every corner of every table, every window groove, every stair-step with meticulous care. Though the place was already spotless, Naomi worked with the precision of someone who knew at places like this perfection wasn't a goal. It was the baseline. By late morning, while Naomi was wiping down the final stretch of the staircase railing, she heard a very faint sound from the forbidden hallway, a door handle turning the soft roll of wheels on hardwood, a quiet but restrained breath. She stood upright instantly, turning around, heart pounding. But no one appeared. Only the light streaming through a crack in the door at the end of the hallway, and the mansion's unsettling silence returning once more. Naomi bent down, resuming her work. But deep inside, she knew someone was in there, and that someone was listening, watching, as if she had just stepped into someone else's story and hadn't yet realized that the first chapter had already begun long before she arrived. Noon on Martha's Vineyard passed in silence, as if the entire world were holding its breath in a nameless moment. The sea breeze drifted softly through the towering glass windows, carrying with it a trace of salt in the air. Inside the vast mansion, Naomi quietly continued her work, her footsteps gliding like silk across the meticulously polished walnut floors. She was cleaning a large mirror at the end of the first-floor hallway, where light from a glass dome above cast a gentle silken hue over the space. The mirror stood nearly as tall as a small room, reflecting the image of a woman in a simple uniform, her face serious and her eyes all too familiar with the weight of constant worry. At that moment, a sound broke the stillness, not loud but enough to make Naomi freeze. A deep, hoarse male voice fractured by anger. "I don't care what you have to do, But don't tell me I have to wait until tomorrow morning to take a damn shower. Naomi looked up, the cleaning cloth still suspended in midair. A trembling female voice replied, I've called 3 agencies. No one has a nurse available on such short notice. I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford. Naomi didn't need to guess where the sound was coming from. The West Wing, the place she had been repeatedly warned to avoid at all costs. Curiosity and concern blended into each of her steps. Naomi moved toward the partially open door, her hand resting lightly on her cleaning cart. She didn't intend to intrude just to make sure nothing urgent was happening. But then, the cart's wheel bumped gently into the wall, making a small but unmistakable thud. Silence. Then the male voice again, sharper now like a blade. Ma, who's there? Naomi flinched. Before she could turn away, a figure emerged from the hallway corner, Mrs. Whitmore wearing a rare expression of discomfort mixed with tension. She's the new girl, the housekeeper said quickly, then turned inward and added, Mr. Ashford, this is Miss Carter, the cleaning staff. A long pause followed. Then from behind the door, the voice came again, calmer now, but no less cutting. Send her in. Naomi froze. It wasn't a request, it was a command. And if it were simply an outburst over inconvenience, why would the man want to see her? Mrs. Whitmore glanced at Naomi, then tilted her head toward the door. He doesn't take no for an answer, she said softly. Whether it was a warning or reassurance, Naomi couldn't tell. She gently pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room beyond didn't resemble any space she had ever seen. A vast private library with shelves stacked from floor to ceiling, bathed in soft light from a modern chandelier that touched the edges of every table, every hardbound book. But what drew the eye most was the man sitting behind a large ebony desk in the corner of the room. Julian Ashford. Even seated, one could tell he had once been tall. Broad shoulders, strong wrists, pale skin of someone rarely exposed to sunlight, and a head of tousled dark brown hair that looked as though it hadn't seen a pair of scissors in months. But nothing was more striking than his eyes, deep blue like gemstones trapped in ice, mesmerizing yet cold enough to send a shiver down the spine. And beside him, a wheelchair. Naomi didn't need to be told. An accident, paralysis, the silence of a lower body no longer responding, and the tightly wound restraint in every breath, every motion, like a caged beast. You're Carter, he asked, eyes locked on hers, gaze filled with skepticism and indifference. Naomi Carter, she answered. I was hired to clean. Well, now I need someone to help me with more than just the floors. His voice was flat, but couldn't hide the bitterness. Naomi glanced at Mrs. Whitmore standing behind him, looking uneasy. I used to be a nurse, Naomi said slowly, her eyes steady. But I need to know exactly what you need and whether I'm allowed to help. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Julian's face. He wasn't used to bluntness, especially not from a black woman in a cleaner's uniform. Help me into the bathroom, he said. I can bathe myself. I just can't get in there alone. Naomi nodded, without hesitation. She had lifted patients twice Julian's size from beds. She had changed bandages on her mother's necrotic wounds. To her, the body wasn't something to fear, it was merely a vessel aging with time. She moved beside the wheelchair. Julian tensed as her hand touched his shoulder, but Naomi said nothing. She supported him gently, as if he were something to be handled with care. Not pity, not fear, just one human helping another. The bathroom was spacious and specially designed metal handrails, a non-slip shower seat, textured stone flooring to prevent falls. Naomi helped him transfer to the seat. Julian said nothing didn't meet her eyes. Only when she stepped back toward the door did he speak quietly. You're not afraid of me. Naomi paused, her hand on the doorframe, and answered steadily. I'm only afraid of people who can't look their own pain in the eye. She stepped out, leaving behind a silence that, strangely enough, no longer felt quite so lonely. The bathroom door closed behind Naomi, the weight of the hinges marking a fine boundary between two worlds inside a man with a hardened face and eyes like frozen glaciers. Outside, a woman with a heart weathered by reality, but still beating in tune with honest emotions. She stood in the quiet hallway, her chest stirred by something she couldn't name. Her feelings didn't arise from seeing the body of a paralyzed man. They came from the way he looked at himself, as if his life had become nothing more than an unfinished draft in an old book. And the way he'd asked, "You're not afraid of me," still echoed in her ears. Naomi let her back rest gently against the wall, her gaze drifting toward the distant bedroom, the one that remained sealed off, silent and devoid of feeling. Part of her wanted to return to the half-finished cleaning in the living room, to pretend the encounter had been just a detour in her routine. But another part stronger kept her standing there, unmoving. 15 minutes later, the door opened again. Not wide, not ajar, but with a hesitance and restraint that felt like someone was trading a piece of pride for a sliver of trust. All done, Julian said, his voice hoarse, whether from the warm water, the silence, or something else she couldn't tell. Naomi stepped in, her expression unchanged, her gaze, as composed as it had been when she left, calm, attentive but never intrusive. Julian sat on the shower seat, the water-off, dark brown hair dripping onto his shoulders. In contrast to his motionless lower half, his upper body still bore the imprint of a life once defined by action, well-defined arm muscles, large and capable hands, each knuckle etched with the memory of a craft he once loved. Naomi draped a towel over his shoulders, firm but not rough. Julian, unthinking, watched her in the mirror, catching the profile of a steady-faced lips, pressed in quiet resolve, and eyes that didn't flinch. "Have you done this work before?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I was a nurse," she replied, "before my mother needed someone at home to care for her." Julian nodded, not a thank you nod, but one of recognition, a discovery, a realization that made it impossible to group her with those who only saw him through the lens of pity. "You know," he said as if thinking aloud, "since the accident, no one really looks me in the eye. Not truly." Naomi said nothing, but it was that silence that gave him room to continue. "They lower their heads, talk to my knees, or to the chair. They use that tone gentle, like they're speaking to a child, or whisper behind my back like I've died and just forgot to lie down." Naomi placed the towel over his shoulders, then helped him into his robe. She didn't respond with surprise or comfort. She simply answered quietly, but in a way that touched the thickest layer of pride. "Because they don't know how to face loss, not yours, their own." Julian looked at her, for the first time unguarded, as if her words had touched a place he'd never allowed anyone to enter. She rolled the wheelchair closer, guiding him gently into it. The moment her hands touched his waist, he flinched, not from pain, but from the feeling of something human, warm, not pity, not fear, just the soft presence of someone who needed no explanation to care. When everything was done, Naomi carefully laid a towel down to wipe the floor. Julian, now steady in his chair, watched every move she made like an architect seeing for the first time the true foundation of his own home. "Earlier you mentioned your mother," he said, his voice low. "Is she—" "All right." Naomi paused. Her eyes softened, but a shadow of sorrow flickered behind them. "No, but I try to keep her from knowing that." Julian didn't say anything else. The room returned to silence, but this time it wasn't stifling. There were no hidden scars to smother, just two people, not whole, not perfect, but coexisting in a small space grounded in something honest. Naomi stepped out, leaving Julian seated before the mirror. He looked at himself, not to check his hair or the stubble on his chin, but to truly see what had just been reflected his own eyes for the first time in 2 years, no longer looking away. Something had changed, not something big, but enough that the sound of his wheels no longer echoed like shackles. Afternoon settled over Aspen Ridge in soft golden hues, casting a gentle glow over the crimson maple trees lining the porch. From a second-floor window, Naomi could see the fading sun stretch across the distant sea, where small waves shimmered like the final breaths of a long, weary day. The scent of resin mingled with the breeze, carrying hints of freshly cut pine from the nearby garden, making her feel as though time moved slower here than anywhere else. She was cleaning the relaxation room, a space filled with bookshelves, armchairs, and a fireplace that hadn't been touched in ages. Thick books, dust-covered and forgotten, lay silently on the shelves. She wiped each spine and table surface as if she were speaking softly to memories that didn't belong to her. Toward the end of her shift, Naomi was packing up her supplies when she noticed Mrs. Whitmore appear at the end of the hallway, her usual brisk, no-nonsense gait unchanged. But today there was something different in the way she stood, as if she were restraining a hesitation. "Mr. Ashford would like to see you," she said, somewhat uncertain. Naomi looked up. "Now, he asked for you in the study," she replied, her expression flickering with something Naomi couldn't quite place, curiosity or caution, she wasn't sure. Naomi washed her hands, straightened her hair, and walked the hallway to the west wing. The familiar wooden door opened again, but this time without the same unease as it had that morning. The room was unchanged, warm lighting, old books, and a piano in the corner, with its lid closed in quiet stillness. Julian sat near the window, the afternoon light cutting across his face, casting sharp lines along his features. He wore a gray sweater, the collar slightly wrinkled, as if it had been through a long stretch of contemplation. A design magazine lay open beside him, but his gaze wasn't fixed on it. "Do you mind if I do this in a way that completely lacks finesse?" he asked without turning around. Naomi took a seat across from him, letting silence serve as her answer. "I want you to come back tomorrow," he said. "Not because the nurse canceled again, but because I need someone who can help me see myself without the lens of pity." Naomi blinked, more surprised by the honesty in his voice than the request itself. "Mr. Ashford," she said softly, "I'm just a cleaner." "No," he cut in. "You're the only person who's ever walked into this room that I haven't wanted to push away." That sentence, coming from another man, might have carried a hint of flirtation charm or implied something more. But from Julian Ashford, a man who'd shut himself off behind a wheelchair and glass walls, it meant something else entirely. A door had cracked open, and even the smallest sliver of light was enough to reach into the long-kept dark. Naomi leaned back in her chair, fingers laced in her lap. "I'll come back," she said, "because my mother needs the money. But if you're asking whether I feel sorry for you, no. I see you as angry, intelligent, a little arrogant, and very bad at accepting help graciously." Julian tilted his head, eyes flashing like sunlight skipping across water, unclear if it was surprise or amusement. "You say that like I'm the toughest case you've ever worked on." "No," Naomi replied with a faint smile. "I once took care of an old doctor with the temperament of a 3-year-old and the authority complex of a general." "You're not there yet." Julian laughed. A real laugh, unrestrained, unguarded. A sound that felt like it had been buried under years of guilt and judgment. "So you'll come tomorrow?" he asked once the laughter softened into a sigh. Naomi nodded, "on one condition." He raised an eyebrow, tilting his head expectantly. "Don't make me call you Mr. Ashford anymore," she said. "I can't do that if I'm scrubbing your floors and buttoning your shirt." There was a brief pause, then he smiled, a genuine smile free of bitterness or defense. "Call me Julian," he said, "as long as Whitmore's not within earshot." Naomi stood, picked up her bag. As she reached the door, Julian called out, "Naomi, is coming in." She stopped and turned. "Do you ever think about what you've left behind?" Her eyes softened, though behind them was an ocean that had once raged but now lay still. "Every day," she replied, "but I also think about what I still have left, even if it's just the smallest bit of hope." Julian didn't respond, but as Naomi walked out of that room, he turned toward the window where the sun had nearly kissed the horizon. His heart beat lightly, faintly, like the first note of a symphony he thought he had long forgotten. The next morning, the sky above Martha's vineyard was veiled in a soft layer of silver mist. The sunlight wasn't yet strong enough to cut through it, only to cast a faint glow, making Aspen Ridge feel like something out of a forgotten fairy tale, or perhaps the whispered remnant of an unfinished dream. Naomi arrived early. She set her bag down on the porch, inhaling the crisp air tinged with pinewood and the salty breath of the sea. This place, still proud, still closed off, seemed to have softened ever so slightly. Or maybe it was she who had changed after last night's conversation with Julian, the man who carried both his physical paralysis and a quiet, stubborn spirit of survival. Mrs. Whitmore greeted her at the door with a gaze more composed than usual, offering a curt nod instead of a spoken hello. Naomi began her work as always, checking the sitting room, replacing the water in the flower vases, straightening the chairs in the reading room. Everything was in its place, yet she redid it all as if organizing her surroundings would help her arrange her thoughts for the day ahead. Around 10 o'clock, while she was carefully folding the silk tablecloth in the dining room, Naomi heard the soft sound of wheelchair wheels from the West Wing hallway. Naomi, Julian's voice called from behind the oak door. "Do you have a moment?" She set the cloth down, wiped her hands, and made her way toward the voice. The door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for someone brave enough to walk through. This time, Julian wasn't behind his desk. He was in the back library, a room that appeared rarely used, or perhaps one no one had ever been invited into. The ceiling was high, the shelves arranged in a wide arc, and a rust-colored Persian rug covered the floor. Light streamed in through tall windows, falling across a drafting table in the corner, where Julian sat with a charcoal pencil in hand. Naomi paused at the threshold. "You called me?" Julian looked up and nodded. "I thought it was time to share something." He gestured to the seat across from him. On the table lay a stack of papers, blueprints, floor plans, and a collection of unfinished building designs. There were spiral glass staircases, arched windows, casting light into skylights, meeting rooms with discreet wheelchair access, each line infused with a modern yet deeply personal beauty. This project, Julian touched one of the sketches. I started it 3 months before the accident. A community center for people who've experienced physical or emotional trauma. A space where accessibility isn't just ramps or rails, but a feeling that you belong the moment you walk in. Naomi looked at the drawings, her eyes softening. Not just because of the talent behind the lines, but because she saw what he had once loved, what he had abandoned in the mud of his loss. You never published it, she asked. Julian shook his head. After the accident, I didn't think I had the right to talk about healing. I couldn't finish the plans without feeling like a fraud. I couldn't draw hope when I was living like a prisoner in the very house I designed. Naomi was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice low but unwavering. No one trusts the light more than someone who's lived in the dark. Julian turned to look at her. His eyes rippled like a lake touched by the gentlest breeze, small waves beginning to spread. You think I should keep going, he asked. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't deflection. It was a real question from a real man. No, Naomi replied, the corner of her mouth lifting. I think you should start over. From that very pain. No one needs you to be perfect. They just need you to be real. Julian smiled faintly. A smile that felt like the lifting of weight. Like the first time he allowed himself to believe in something again. She stood, stepping closer to the table to examine a design that overlooked the sea. Here she pointed at a blank space in the plan. This would be a great spot for an art room, or maybe a small play area, not just for those in therapy, but for kids whose parents are in treatment. Julian followed her finger, then nodded. A point of view not tied to illness, but to life, he echoed, as if committing it to memory. Neither of them said anything more, but in that quiet, something invisible formed between them, a thread spun, not from sympathy or pity, but understanding. As Naomi reached the doorway to leave, she turned back. Julian, Turin. Yeah. If you'll allow me to clean this room, I will. But don't ask me to erase the smudges on your sketches. Julian laughed out loud, a warm, deep sound, the first time such laughter had stretched across the mansion in what felt like forever. Don't worry, he said. For the first time, I think I want to keep them all. A sudden rain fell over Martha's Vineyard on a midweek afternoon, turning the sky a washed-out gray, like a painting smeared by a wet hand, wiping away its final colors. The Aspen Ridge mansion seemed to curl in on itself, cocooned in quiet, broken only by the gentle tapping of raindrops on the glass roof, and the faint aroma of coffee drifting in from the side kitchen. Naomi was upstairs reshelving thick technical books in the old library. The dim outdoor light was so faint that even the wall sconces couldn't chase away the quiet gloom seeping through the windows. But her mind was far from somber. It had been 3 weeks since the first day she'd stepped into Julian Ashford's world. Each morning had begun with brief exchanges, sometimes curt, but always ending with a look that grew less cold. Every day left her with the same quiet realization: this man, buried under isolation and self-defense, was slowly shedding something heavy and long-worn. Naomi didn't think she was changing him. She only felt that for the first time in years, she wasn't just invisible passing through someone's life. She was present, and someone was beginning to see that. The doorbell rang, slicing through the mist like a blade. Naomi paused, listening to Mrs. Whitmore's steady footsteps descending to the first floor. She didn't think much of it. Visitors at Aspen Ridge were rare, and when they came, they were usually delivering flowers or office supplies. But minutes later, the sound of high heels echoed in the foyer, confident, deliberate, belonging to someone who clearly knew they belonged here. The sound was unmistakable in its precision and pride. Naomi stepped out of the library and leaned over the banister to glance down the hallway. Standing there, bathed in muted light, was a woman whose beauty bordered on unreal platinum blonde hair, pulled into a flawless chignon wine-red lips, and a tailored cream coat hugging her slender frame. She carried no umbrella. The raindrops clinging to her shoulders looked intentional, as if the weather itself were part of her grand entrance. Who is she? Naomi whispered, mostly to herself. Mrs. Whitmore tilted slightly, her voice as soft as a falling leaf. Miss Clarissa Langford. Mr. Ashford's former fiancée. Naomi's chest tightened, not from jealousy but from surprise. The name Clarissa had come up once before, briefly on another rainy afternoon. Just a name accompanied by a faint, bitter smile and a single sentence: she couldn't handle who I became. Clarissa turned just as Naomi failed to look away in time. Her gaze wasn't sharp like a blade. It was soft like silk, but somehow it cut deeper than steel. She smiled politely and said, "Hello." I didn't realize Aspen Ridge still maintains such enthusiastic staff. Naomi didn't reply, only gave a small nod. She didn't need to declare her role. The things that mattered were proven over time, not printed on a name tag. "Is Julian home?" Clarissa asked, next eyes never leaving Naomi. A simple question, but it landed like a claim. I am the one who was once invited here by the owner's love. "He's in the drawing room," Naomi answered, her tone steady. "I can let him know." "No need," Clarissa interrupted, lips tightening in a restrained smile. "He'll want to see me." And then, as if the floor belonged to her heels, Clarissa walked toward the west wing, the very space Naomi had once been warned never to enter. This time no one stopped her. Naomi stood motionless in the hallway, not shaken, but not entirely at peace either. Something in Clarissa's absolute poise chilled the air in the mansion a few degrees colder. It wasn't Julian's old indifference, it was the cold of unresolved history. A quiet sound from upstairs pulled Naomi back to her duties. She returned to the library, but her hands no longer moved with focus. Every one of her senses strained toward that closed door where Clarissa had just entered, bringing with her the remnants of Julian's deepest scars. Nearly an hour passed before Julian appeared in the hallway, his face drawn and weary. Naomi was dusting a picture frame and looked up just as he rolled past. She said she wanted to see how much of the old me was still left. Julian said, not meeting Naomi's eyes. His voice was like fog, soft, but if you listened closely, you'd hear the fracture forming in every word. Naomi set the cloth down. "And did you," she asked, "see it?" Julian stopped. He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, but not in the way she meant. I'm no longer the Julian I used to be. But I'm also not the man the accident convinced me I'd become." Naomi looked at him. In his eyes, something new had taken root, not just the resilience she had come to recognize, but a sliver of light, faint and rare, as if silently affirming that even when the past knocks on your door, the present now speaks in its own voice. A week after the unexpected arrival of Clarissa Langford, Aspen Ridge seemed to be trying to regain its usual quiet rhythm. But for Naomi, nothing felt quite the same. Not because Julian had changed, but because Clarissa's presence seemed to have awakened a part of his memory Naomi hadn't yet come close enough to touch. On a Friday afternoon, as the sky blushed pink with the day's last sunlight, Naomi was cleaning the study when Julian suddenly spoke. "Do you have plans for tomorrow night?" Naomi looked up a little surprised. She shook her head. "I usually don't make plans other than going to bed early on weekends." Julian offered a faint smile, the kind that made his weariness look soft rather than heavy. "Well then, will you come with me?" Naomi paused. "Go where?" "A charity gala at Harborview," he replied, his voice light, as if asking her to fetch a glass of water, not inviting her to one of the East Coast's most prestigious events. "It's hosted by the Neurological Research Center. I'm one of their major donors. And this year they want to honor me." Naomi didn't know whether to feel flattered or apprehensive. A housekeeper attending a gala with a billionaire sounded like the first page of a romance novel. But Julian's tone wasn't theatrical. He looked at her as if out of everyone he could have chosen, she was the only one he wanted beside him. The next evening, Naomi stood in front of the mirror in the small room above the garage. The off-shoulder black dress Mrs. Whitmore had delivered fit perfectly, not too showy, but elegant enough to highlight her collarbones and shoulders. Her natural curls were swept into a loose updo, with a few tendrils framing her face like soft brushstrokes across delicate features. She wasn't used to seeing herself this way, not because of the elegance, but because the woman in the mirror no longer avoided her own reflection. She stood there confident and calm, as if stepping into a space that had long been hers. Julian waited in the front hall dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit. He was still in his wheelchair, but his expression held a strange sense of ease. No tension, no doubt. When Naomi descended the stairs, he looked up at her and said nothing. But the look in his eyes and told her everything. He saw her. The gala was held at the Harborview Hotel, where towering white marble columns held up a hand-painted gold glass ceiling. Crystal chandeliers, sparkled violin music floated through the air, and polite laughter wove itself into a symphony of wealth and power. All eyes turned to Julian Ashford as he entered the grand hall with a woman no one recognized. The murmurs began to ripple, not because of the wheelchair, but because of the black woman beside him, unlike anyone from his usual circles. Clarissa appeared less than 10 minutes later. Her hair was straightened like polished glass. Her wine-red gown hugged her slender frame, and her gaze was sharp-honed by pride and pain. She approached, raising a glass of champagne. Julian, she smiled, her eyes brushing past Naomi without contact. It's been a while since I've seen you arrive with anyone. Julian didn't rush to reply. He looked at Naomi as if asking her silently for permission before saying something that mattered. Let me introduce you, he said slowly. This is Naomi Wells, the only person who's ever walked into my drawing room without asking and rearranged my heart without warning. Clarissa froze, though her smile didn't falter. The glass in her hand tilted slightly as if her fingers had lost an invisible anchor. Naomi bowed her head politely, saying nothing, but her eyes didn't look away. She wasn't here to compete. She was here because she'd been chosen, and that Clarissa could not deny. The speeches began as the lights dimmed. Julian was invited to the stage, a platform with a ramp built just for him. He rolled forward to polite applause, but also to 100 expectant eyes wondering whether the once proud icon of the tech world still had something to say now that he could no longer stand. Thank you, he began. There's one thing my accident taught me. It's that some pain doesn't need to be healed. It needs to be accepted. And in that acceptance, we rediscover ourselves. He paused, turning slightly toward the audience, where Naomi looked up at him, not clapping, not glowing, just still understanding and full of quiet trust. Someone once told me no one trusts the light more than someone who's lived in the dark. Tonight I believe that's true, because I've found my light. No one knew what that light was, but every head turned to follow Julian's gaze fixed on Naomi. Clarissa left the gala midway through without a word. The sound of her heels striking the marble floor echoed like the final note of a symphony in which she no longer played the lead. That night, as they returned to Aspen Ridge, Julian said nothing. Naomi didn't either. But when his hand reached for hers, it wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a silent promise. No matter how many spotlights shine on the past, the present still belongs to those brave enough to begin again. The early spring breeze on Martha's Vineyard always carried a mild saltiness from the sea, and a hint of warmth that threaded itself through every strand of hair, as if the sky and earth were quietly whispering of something awakening, silent, yet powerful. After the gala night, Aspen Ridge seemed to exhale. No more sharp, high-heeled footsteps, no more probing glances from the past. Everything returned to silence, but it was a sweet, complete kind of silence. Naomi continued her work as usual, though something had shifted. Julian now appeared more often wherever she was. In the morning when Naomi watered the newly planted lavender beds, Julian was already out on the veranda, wrapped in a light blanket over his legs, wearing a pebble-gray turtleneck sweater. He didn't speak. He simply watched the dew evaporate from the petals, as if relearning how to listen to life through someone else's hands. In the afternoon, as she selected books in the library, Julian would wheel quietly into the room, leaving behind a faint scent of musk from his aftershave. He'd pretend to look for an old volume, then stay asking her a few questions about a Langston Hughes poem. Their conversation would stretch into the evening unnoticed by either of them. Naomi harbored no illusions. She knew those small changes weren't confessions, but she also knew better than to dismiss them. For Julian, every action, no matter how small, carried weight. One Wednesday afternoon, with a fine mist draping the red maples in a veil of rain, Julian called Naomi to the study. On the dark ebony desk sat a small velvet box, not the kind for jewelry, but for a vintage watch. It belonged to my father, he said, opening the lid gently. Inside was a silver pocket watch, its ivory face slightly yellowed, the blue steel hands faint with age. He wore it until the day he died. I kept it afterward, but I never touched it. Naomi stepped closer, gazing at the object held with such care, as if it were the relic of a dream never fulfilled. I want you to have it, Julian said. Naomi looked up, eyebrows gently drawn. Why? Julian paused for a long moment, then answered slowly, clearly. Because I couldn't hold on to my father or to myself, but I believe you can hold on to something else for me, something I haven't dared to name until today. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. He looked at her, really looked for the first time, with nothing hidden in his eyes. No defenses, no shame, no walls. Naomi, he said her name softly, but it rang louder than any bell that had ever sounded in that house. Naomi said nothing. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes deep and still like quiet water. She didn't need to ask what he meant, because when he spoke her name like that, it was already the gentlest confirmation. That evening, the kitchen filled with the scent of baked apple pie, the first thing Julian had ever called delicious since the accident. They didn't eat like employer and employee, but like two people slowly discovering each other in each melting spoonful of ice cream, each soft, fragrant bite of apple. Julian asked her about the old house in Brooklyn, where she grew up with her mother and grandmother, about the power outages and how she learned to tell stories by candlelight for her younger cousins. Naomi told him with a voice like velvet, and Julian listened intently like a student hearing fairy tales for the first time. As night crept in through the windows, Naomi stood to clear the table. Julian suddenly reached for her hand. "Stay a while," he whispered. Naomi paused, not out of surprise, but because she hadn't expected to want to stay so much. They sat together by the fireplace. The flames danced like someone playing piano with fingers of fire. Julian rested his head gently against Naomi's shoulder, not as a man seeking salvation, but as someone who had finally found a place to rest. Naomi ran her fingers lightly through his hair, her heart light as silk. In that moment, there was no past, no wound, no guilt to justify. Just a man and a woman sitting in silence, calling each other's names with their hearts. Neither of them said, "I love you" or "I need you." But love doesn't always require words. Some feelings only need to be named once to affirm an entire lifetime. One early March morning, with traces of snow still clinging to the grass along the roadside, Naomi was making tea for Julian when the phone in her coat pocket buzzed a call from the Central Hospital in Brooklyn. She hesitated for a second, then stepped out of the kitchen, politely excusing herself. Julian nodded, but there was already an unspoken worry in his eyes. Naomi answered the call on the porch, where the lavender she had planted was just beginning to bud for the new season. "Miss Wells," a nurse's voice came through, polite but urgent. "We need to inform you. Your mother, Mrs. Amelia Wells, was admitted to the ICU early this morning." Naomi gripped the phone tightly. "Is it her heart?" Her voice cracked. "Heart and lungs," the nurse replied gently. "She tried to hold on until morning, but the prognosis is poor. If any family wants to say goodbye." Naomi didn't wait for the rest. She hung up, standing motionless like someone who had just been pulled violently out of the earth. Julian saw her through the glass. When Naomi walked back in, her face showed no emotion, no tears, no panic. But something in her eyes made him set his teacup down. "Naomi?" She looked up, lips pressed tight to contain the storm rising inside her. "My mother's dying," she said, her voice strangely calm. "I have to go back to Brooklyn." Julian didn't ask questions, didn't offer pity. He simply said, "Let me take you to the airport." Naomi wanted to decline but couldn't summon the strength. As she packed hastily, she caught his gaze while he helped her fold the wool blanket she always used by the fireplace. "You don't have to do this." "No," he replied, "but I want to." It was the first time Naomi let someone see her fragile. In the car all the way to the airport, she said nothing, and Julian stayed beside her in silence, not trying to console her, not filling the air with words, just a steady, patient presence. Brooklyn Memorial Hospital always smelled of antiseptic mixed with chilled air. Naomi hurried down the hallway, passing nurses with the hollow eyes of someone too familiar with fleeting hope. Room 413, her mother lay there, small and fragile, as if time had drained every last drop of life. Amelia still looked beautiful. Though deep lines creased her face, her closed eyes and pale skin retained the gentleness Naomi remembered from childhood. The woman who once juggled 3 jobs to feed and educate her daughter was now fighting for each breath just to hold on a little longer. Naomi sat beside the bed and held her mother's hand. It was cold but soft, like a towel left too long in the morning dew. "Mom," Naomi whispered, "I'm here." A tear slid from the corner of Amelia's eye, even though her lids stayed closed. Her breath hitched, then settled like a sail slipping beneath the surface. The doctor stepped in and nodded gently at Naomi. "We've done everything we can. She may only have a few hours." Naomi didn't scream or collapse like a character in a tragedy. She simply leaned forward, resting her forehead on her mother's hand, and began whispering, like telling one last story. "You used to say if the day came when you weren't here anymore, I should live for both of us. I never really understood that until I met Julian." She told her mother about the island mansion, about quiet sunrises, about morning tea and evenings by the fire, about a man who had lost everything but still managed to see the value in others. She spoke not so her mother would understand, but so she herself could. That love isn't something we wait for, it's something we choose to believe in, something we choose to keep. An hour later, Amelia passed peacefully, as if slipping into a deep sleep. Naomi stayed for a long while. The hospital grew still as night fell. The hallway lights dimmed like the last whispered blessing of a mother to her daughter. 3 days later, Naomi returned to Aspen Ridge. She didn't say much. Julian met her on the porch in his familiar wheelchair, though his face betrayed a deep relief to see her safe. Naomi walked to him and stood still. My mother is gone. I know, he said softly. She told me to live for both of us. Julian looked up at her, the deep blue of his eyes reflecting a wordless understanding. Then let's start from here, he whispered. Naomi nodded. There was no embrace, no kiss, but there was the quiet presence of someone who waited for you to come back, even if you returned with aching feet and a heart cracked open. That night, Naomi slept in the old guest room, but left the window slightly ajar. Outside, the sea whispered, as if retelling the story of a mother who had passed on, and a daughter learning to love life as though her heart had never known pain. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year on Martha's vineyard. New buds pushed up from the soil, as if nature's heart had finally grown tired of winter's long silence. Aspen Ridge was covered in a soft green sheen of fresh grass, and sunlight filtered through glass panes gilding the study where Julian often sat by the oak shelves. Naomi had started planting more flowers, not because Julian asked, but because she felt the need to let something take root in the garden and in her own heart. She was no longer the woman afraid of feeling too much or of confronting depth. Her mother's death had taught her that time was finite, and love, when it comes, must be lived fully, second by second. Julian, too, had changed after witnessing Naomi's grief. He began physical therapy with renewed determination, no longer going through the motions but engaging with real pain, real sweat, and real will. Naomi saw him at times gritting his teeth until his face turned pale and his hands shook, but he never gave up. Do you think I'm running from something? Julian asked one afternoon after a grueling session. Naomi was peeling a pear. Her hands paused for a moment, then she shook her head. No, I think you're trying to be born again. Julian smiled, a rare smile from someone who had spent so long denying himself the right to hope. I used to think I'd already died. Not physically, but the part of me that believed in anything. Ambition, self-worth, even dignity. Naomi walked over and offered him a slice of pear. And now, he looked at her. I think I'm coming back to life, and you're the only reason why. But resurrection always comes hand in hand with death, the death of a past, of things long held, of people once present who no longer belong. That day, a woman appeared at the mansion gates. Naomi was tidying the sitting room when the doorbell rang. On the monitor, she saw a tall blonde woman in designer clothing, standing upright with the posture of someone long acquainted with power. Julian didn't mention expecting anyone, Naomi murmured. She opened the gate. You're Naomi Wells, the woman asked, her voice sharp. Yes, and you are? I'm Elizabeth Monroe, Julian's former fiancée. Naomi froze, not at the name, but at the way the woman said it, not like an ex-lover, but like someone demanding to reclaim ownership. Elizabeth entered as though she had never left. She didn't ask if Julian would receive her. She simply sat down like time had reversed, and she was still the mistress of the house. Julian knows I'm here, Elizabeth said, eyes fixed on Naomi. And I won't stay long. I just need him to understand what I left behind I can take back at any time. Naomi said nothing, but her gaze was steady calm, like a lake that had already survived a storm. When Julian appeared, Naomi stood by the window, her eyes on the garden, where the lavender had just begun to bloom. He looked at Elizabeth, then at Naomi. Go wait in the sitting room, he said to Naomi gently. She nodded and stepped away, leaving the two with history between them. Elizabeth didn't waste time. You've changed, Julian, not just physically, but inside. People who survive accidents and betrayal tend to, Julian replied coldly. Elizabeth let out a hollow laugh. You used to be the perfect man. I left because I wanted something bigger. I thought you wouldn't be able to move on. But now, seeing you like this, maybe I was wrong. Julian wheeled closer, his hand resting on the arm of his chair. You weren't wrong, but I'm not the same man anymore. My death began the day you left, and my rebirth doesn't include you. Elizabeth arched a brow. Because of her, the black housekeeper. Julian met her eyes. Because of Naomi, she's not a replacement. She's the beginning. Elizabeth gave a bitter smile. You'll regret this. Maybe, but I'd rather regret believing in something new than live forever clinging to what's already dead. Elizabeth left before dusk, leaving behind a silence that settled over the mansion like dust. Naomi didn't ask Julian what was said, but when he came to her, placed his hand over hers and softly said, "Thank you for not walking away," she knew a chapter had closed. That night, Julian went to bed earlier than usual. Naomi stayed in the sitting room holding an old book from her mother, a faded journal Amelia once wrote about caring for patients who had no one left. Whenever someone has lost all hope, she had written, be the first to believe they can come back. Naomi smiled and closed the book. Between death and resurrection, there is always a bridge called faith, and now both she and Julian had begun to walk across it, not quickly, not fearfully, but with all the honesty they had left. That morning's dawn broke after a long night of rain, leaving streaks of water on the glass panes of Julian's study. On the desk lay thick stacks of old documents coated in the dust of time, and the laptop he hadn't touched in 2 years since the accident. Naomi entered carrying a cup of hot coffee and a watchful gaze. "Another sleepless night?" she asked softly. Julian smiled, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "Almost. A few numbers finally made me feel alive again." It had been a long time since Naomi had heard that spark in his voice. It wasn't the flat tone of someone resigned to fade into the background. This was Julian, the man who once made the financial world on both sides of the Atlantic tread carefully, who built one of New York's most innovative investment firms from scratch, and an unstoppable mind. Since the accident, Julian had severed all ties with work. No meetings, no investments, no restructurings, just silence and withdrawal. But a phone call 2 weeks earlier had reawakened something dormant within him. Julian came the voice of Evelyn Ward, his former chief strategy officer, through the speakerphone. "The board is planning a merger with a Middle Eastern conglomerate. If that happens, the company you built will be split apart." Julian closed his eyes. His hand clenched the armrest of his wheelchair. "I need you to come back. No one understands the company's structure like you do, and no one else can stop this." Julian said nothing, but that night he reopened old financial reports, called his legal advisors, and now he sat here within the same room where he once crafted market-shaking strategies, with eyes burning like someone who had walked through hell just to reclaim a forgotten flame. Naomi watched him, not to stop him, nor to urge him on. She understood that this man needed to fight, not only to protect what he had built, but to reclaim a part of his dignity buried in the aftermath of that accident where both his body and soul had plunged into an endless abyss. The day he decided to reappear at the shareholders' meeting, the financial world trembled. Julian Blackwood, the survivor of that infamous crash, the symbol of ruthless strategic vision, was returning to the field. The meeting was held at the company's Manhattan headquarters. Beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, amidst a sea of gray suits and silk ties, the doors to the boardroom opened. Julian wheeled in, spine-straight gaze unwavering. Naomi walked beside him in a sleek beige suit, her eyes sharp, nothing like the housemaid she once was. They looked like an unlikely pair, a man from the world of high finance and a woman who once mopped floors to pay for her mother's medication. But no one dared to underestimate Naomi now. Not when she had been the one leading the analysis that Julian used to dismantle the illegal merger plan. He began to speak, his voice low but resolute. "You may have forgotten who I am, but you cannot forget who built the financial framework you're all profiting from. I founded this company, and today I won't let it be sold off like clearance merchandise at a closing auction." The room was silent as Julian presented data charts and proof showing the merger would result in the company losing control of its proprietary AI technology, opening the door to manipulation from foreign funds. As the board chairman faltered, Julian delivered his final line. "You can choose to step back 5 paces or move forward just once and prove this company still has a soul." The vote was cast, 8-7. The merger was rejected. Julian remained seated, no wave, no triumphant grin, but his eyes gleamed like a phoenix rising from ashes. That evening, as Naomi and Julian returned to Aspen Ridge, early summer winds rustled through the pine trees. She sat across from him in the living room, where it all began with those first cups of tea. "You got the company back," she said, half as a statement, half in disbelief. "I didn't get the company back," Julian replied. "I got myself back." Naomi looked at him, the man who once broke apart before her eyes, now slowly rebuilding himself, not to prove anything to the world, but to keep a promise to her, that as long as he breathed, he would fight for what was worth it. And that night, for the first time after a life shrouded in darkness, Naomi reached out and took his hand. Not as a companion, but as someone who believes that no matter how broken life leaves us, if just one person believes in our rebirth, miracles can still happen. The pale gray wooden house nestled behind a row of maple trees just 100 steps from the Nantucket shoreline. On an early summer morning, Naomi paused at the white gate, her hands still dusted with paint from the day before. The scent of sea salt and lavender drifted through the air, soft and tender, like a hand brushing gently over old wounds. This house had once been an old dream tucked away in a drawer. Not because it was too far-fetched, but because Naomi had never believed she had the right to dream of something just for herself. But now it wasn't just a place to live, it was a beginning. Julian had purchased the home from an elderly family in Cape Cod and secretly renovated it as a gift for Naomi, not lavish like the grand estates of Manhattan, but filled with the breath of freedom and gentleness. He let her choose the curtains, arrange the bookshelves, and decide where the armchair would sit to catch the best view of sunset. This house, Julian said on their first afternoon sitting on the porch together, isn't a gift. It's a commitment. If you've spent your life living for others, then from now on, live for yourself. Naomi sat quietly, emotions swirling inside her. She had walked past so many luxurious homes in her life, believing they only held cold hearts inside. But this house wasn't cold. It was warm, warm, like Julian's gaze, like the way he stayed silent but present, like the way he placed more faith in her than he had ever placed in himself. Their new life didn't begin with fireworks or champagne, but with little things. Naomi learned to wake early just to watch the sun sparkle on the waves. She began writing again small pieces for the local community magazine, telling stories of slow living, of people she met back when she cleaned houses, of loss and rebirth that she had witnessed firsthand. Julian, though he had returned to the business world, kept his promise. Every weekend he came home. They planted trees together, played chess, or simply sat in silence. That silence was no longer heavy. It was the harmony of two people who had weathered storms and finally found each other. But not everything came easily. Some nights Naomi dreamed of her mother. In her dreams, Amelia sat at the foot of the bed, smiling gently, still holding the old wooden comb she used to brush Naomi's hair. "Are you okay, Naomi?" she would ask. Naomi would wake with tears in her eyes and a tightness in her chest. She wondered, was she truly living her own life, or was she just masking sorrow with borrowed happiness? That question returned on quiet afternoons when Julian was away. She'd glance around the house, see the stove cold, see the indentation left on his chair, and feel the old loneliness creep back like a familiar shadow. Until one day, Naomi received a parcel from the law office where her mother had once filed documents. Inside was a yellowed folder and a handwritten letter from Amelia. "My dearest Naomi, if you're reading this, it means I could not walk the rest of the way with you. But I don't want you to remember me only through tears. I'm leaving you something, not money, but the right to choose. This folder contains the records of your father's estate, a man I never spoke of because you were too young. But now you're grown, and you have the right to decide to continue living a peaceful life or to trace your roots and understand where you come from. Whatever you choose, remember this: you deserve to know the truth, and you deserve happiness, Naomi." Naomi finished the letter with trembling hands. She looked up at the sea. The surface shimmered gold like shards of broken mirror. Her heart churned like the tide pulling in, flowing out endless. She didn't tell Julian right away. But that night when he returned, she walked up to him, placed a hand gently on his shoulder and said, "There's something I need to do, a road I haven't walked." Julian looked at her, asked nothing, and simply nodded. "I'll be here when you return. This house will always wait for you." Naomi stepped off the porch, the sea breeze tossing her hair. She turned back to look at the house, the first home to bear her name, holding a man who didn't just love her, but saw her a love that didn't confine, but freed. She smiled. Sometimes starting a new life isn't about staying. It's knowing when to leave, to return stronger, fuller, and to love more deeply than ever before. The first snow of the season fell softly on the roof of the seaside cottage, blanketing the white fence with a velvet-like powder. In the distance, the horizon faded into a wintry mist, as if the world were holding its breath, awaiting something sacred. Naomi returned on such an afternoon. She walked through the bare maple trees, her steps unhurried, draped in a dark earth-tone sweater. A small suitcase rolled behind her, its wheels leaving faint tracks on the damp, thawing path. There was no fanfare, no excited welcome. Only the sound of the sea wind and the quiet thrum of her heartbeat like a whispering drum. Julian hadn't met her at the pier. She hadn't told him she was coming. Perhaps part of her wanted to keep this moment of return private, untouched by ceremony, belonging only to herself. When the wooden door creaked open, the house was just as she remembered, warm, quiet, and scented with pine wood and soft cinnamon. In the kitchen, the kettle still rested on the old gas stove, as if always waiting to be lit. On the dining table, a half-knitted scarf lay unfinished, and a book was folded open at chapter 31. Naomi set her suitcase down and stepped into the living room. Her eyes landed on a photo on the shelf she and Julian, standing side by side before the snowy peaks of Colorado, the day he told her that though the world could be cold, human hearts could stay warm enough to carry one another through the longest winter. She didn't know how long she stood there until the door behind her quietly clicked open. Julian appeared in the frame like a portrait come to life. He wore a navy overcoat, his hair tousled by the sea breeze, and his blue eyes held something deeper than any word could capture. "I knew you'd come back," he said, his voice a soft, low melody. Naomi turned, saying nothing. She just looked at him as if every question had already melted in that one instant. "I found my father," she whispered. "He wasn't who I thought he'd be." Julian stepped closer, gently brushing her cheek with his hand. "You don't need to explain. Just know I'm still here." Naomi closed her eyes. Her heart softened like ice melting into streams beneath the spring sun. She had traveled far not to find answers, but to realize that love doesn't reside in beginnings, but in the one who waits after every detour. That night, the snow thickened. Julian asked her to come outside, a rare thing for someone who disliked the cold. But he gave no reason. He simply took her hand and led her to the backyard where they once laid a summer blanket to stargaze. Naomi hesitated when she saw what awaited her: glass lanterns strung from tree to tree, casting a gentle golden glow across a sea of white. In the center of the yard sat a small round wooden table, draped in embroidered cloth with a red velvet ring box, slightly ajar, a bouquet of white tulips, and two champagne flutes beaded with snow. She turned to Julian, lips parting to speak, but he was already kneeling. No grand gestures, no speeches. Just a man who had known darkness now, trembling, as he held up a simple ring, eyes, locked on the woman who had pulled him out of his longest night. "Naomi Elise Hartwell," he began, his voice hoarse from cold, from emotion, from everything he had carried for years. "You once helped me survive. Now all I want is to live with you. No conditions, no explanations, just you." Naomi looked at him. Everything that had once made her afraid, the differences, the past, the status, the wounds yet to heal, dissolved in the snowfall that gently dusted her hair. She nodded. No words, just a single tear that slid past smiling lips as she bent down and let him slip the ring onto her finger. The snow kept falling, but neither felt the cold. In each other's arms, beneath the soft lights and the silvery sky, they knew this wasn't just a proposal. It was the moment two people, two souls, two jagged histories, had finally found each other in a love gentle enough to heal and strong enough to stay. A soft spring breeze rustled the curtains, carrying the scent of lavender and sea salt. The seaside cottage looked the same, but inside everything had changed. Not the furniture or the color of the walls, but something invisible, the breath of two people truly living for each other, because of each other, with each other. Naomi sat in a slate gray linen armchair, a forgotten book resting open on her lap. Outside on the porch, Julian was pruning the climbing roses, his movements calm and deliberate, as if he belonged to the very landscape. Every time she looked at him like that, her heart skipped a beat, not from doubt but from overwhelming emotion. There are things that once seemed too far away to ever belong to you, and people who seem to pass through your life only to remind you how alone you were. But time and quiet, patient presence had rewritten those definitions. Naomi had once been a woman carrying the weight of old wounds. Julian had once been a man imprisoned in a body that betrayed him and in a pride that had been shattered. But the miracle wasn't that one had saved the other. It was that both had dared to open their hearts knowing they might get hurt again. The months passed in a gentle rhythm. Naomi began teaching again, not at a prestigious university, but at a small community center on the edge of town. She opened a writing class for senior single mothers and anyone who had once believed they didn't have a voice. And through each page, each story shared, she awakened something long buried in them: emotion. Julian, after slowly regaining function in his right hand, began to draw again. He didn't tell anyone, not even Naomi. He simply sketched the sunny mornings, the quiet afternoons on the porch, the snow-filled nights seen through frosted windows, all the moments he had once dismissed as too small to matter. Until one evening, Naomi discovered a sketch of herself asleep at her desk, her hair a gentle mess, warm lamplight spilling over her soft brown skin, her lips slightly parted as if mid-dream, and she wept. She didn't cry because he made her look beautiful. She cried because, for the first time, she felt truly seen, wholly seen by a man who never asked her to be anything but herself. One quiet afternoon, Naomi asked Julian, "Do you think, if I were someone else, someone who hadn't been poor, hadn't worked as a maid, Hadn't been a woman of color, would you still have chosen me? Julian paused, eyes never leaving hers. No, he said. She stiffened slightly, her heart skipping for a different reason. I wouldn't choose you if you were someone else, he continued softly. Because I don't want anyone else but you. Everything you've lived through, everything you've endured and overcome, that's what makes you the woman I love. I don't love a version of you, Naomi. I love you, whole, without condition. She didn't speak. She simply walked over, rested her head on his shoulder, and felt the world grow astonishingly quiet. They didn't throw a grand wedding, just a small ceremony by the sea with a few close friends, wildflowers, and two simple silver rings. She wore a white dress she had sewn herself. He stood under an arch of olive branches and ivy propped on a cane waiting. When she approached, he looked at her as if he had never seen anything more beautiful. Their vows were brief, not from lack of words, but because they knew the most important promises aren't spoken. They're lived, in days shared, in pain endured, in the quiet decision to choose each other again and again. One early summer morning, Naomi woke earlier than usual. She stepped onto the porch with a cup of mint tea and watched the sun rise over the deep blue horizon. Julian came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You know, he murmured, love is the only thing that doesn't need sameness to work. We're not alike, Naomi, but that's what makes us strong. She leaned into him and whispered, love doesn't need to match. It just needs to be real. And in that morning light, where the sea shimmered like 1,000 mirrors reflecting the past, the present, and the future, they understood true love knows no limits. No color, no status, no past. Only hearts brave enough to believe and hands willing to hold.